is really Spider-Man's most iconic villain and arch nemesis? Welcome back, Nerd Squad! Well, the past few years, Otto Octavius, aka Dr. Octopus, has played a key role as Spider-Man's main villain. There is really only one man who should take the cake when it comes to the sheer amount of intensity and suffering that he has caused Peter Parker, and that is Norman Osborn. We normally know Norman Osborn as the Green Goblin, and for this list I'll be focusing on all sorts of evil deeds that he's committed while both in and out of this persona and identity. Join me as we count down the top 10 worst things the Green Goblin has done. Alright, let's get counting. Number 10, Reshaped the Universe. This one only gets ranked lower because it comes to us from the alternate reality of a what-if comic. In this what-if story, Norman Osborn gets his hands on the Infinity Gauntlet and uses it to reshape reality, all to impress his daddy. What's even more awful is when his father confesses that he actually loves him. Norman then can't even bring himself to believe his father's acceptance, and in the end destroys his father, thereby destroying himself in the process. So, this was in a weird way not just a bad thing he did to reality, but also did to his own self. Which I guess would be a good thing for reality. Definitely be a good thing for Spider-Man. Number 9, Cheated. We find out about this one in Red Goblin, Red Death, and what's worse, it's a story that in the present day of that comic has a pretty gruesome ending. Here, Norman runs into an old Empire University pal, if you could call him that. Ned Tobolowsky was someone Norman knew in school, and it's implied that at least they were friends, or at least acquaintances, before Ned spilled the beans about a cheating apparatus that Norman was using and had built. Ned's big mouth almost cost Norman his schooling. He lost his scholarship and was almost expelled, like these close. Honestly, if he created a cheating machine though, he probably should have been expelled in my opinion. Like, I don't know how they let him continue going to school after that. Norman gets Ned back though when Ned stops him on the street years later while he is Red Goblin. Not a good time. So true, what happens to Ned at least wasn't necessarily Green Goblin's doing, but I'm gonna count this anyways because 1, this thing happened way in his past, and 2, this list is more centered around Osborn as Goblin as opposed to like any specific Goblin identity. It's called Green Goblin, but I'm approaching it as like a Norman Osborn list. I know we've seen others wear that mantle as well, but I think Norman by far is one of the most dastardly goblins out there, red, green, or otherwise. Number 8, Framed Spider-Man. If you think J. Jonah Jameson is bad, wait till you see what happens when Osborn takes over control of the Daily Bugle. At one point, Norman Osborn tries to use the paper himself to drag Spider-Man's name through the mud after buying it and then blackmailing Jameson into giving him full control over the paper and what gets published there. He then frames Spider-Man for murder, making it look like his webbing basically caused someone to die by asphyxiation, and puts a bounty on Spider-Man's head, starting off the Spider Hunt story arc. Of course, Peter finds a way out of all of this trouble and makes sure that Norman gets his in the end, but he still has to suffer through everyone hunting him down and believing that he was a killer, so still, it's pretty terrible. And before we move on to this next spot, just a quick reminder to give this video a thumbs up if you love Norman as much as we do. Love-hate. Number 7, Transformed Carly Cooper. And not in a good way. While under the mantle of Goblin King, Norman sought information from Carly on the true identity of Superior Spider-Man. He had her kidnapped, and when she refused to give up the information, she refused. He decided to recruit her into his Goblin army. Exposing her to the Goblin formula, he turned Carly into one of his own deranged minions, and for a time she served him under the mantle of Monster. She would eventually be returned to her former self, but this experience would leave its mark, changing Carly forever. Immediately after her recovery, she also cut Peter Parker and Spider-Man out of her life and moved from New York to New Orleans. Though she would come back. She would get over it, but it was still pretty terrible. Number 6, drove Harry insane. I mean, I don't think we can blame Norman for all of Harry's villainous actions, but we can definitely blame him, I think, for most of them. As of late, Harry has resurfaced as the villain known as Kindred, twisted into some combination of Harry's soul combined with that of a demon. This even darker version of Harry blames both Peter and his father for everything that went wrong in his life, and comes back to hold them both accountable and make them pay. I guess you could also look at it in the way that Norman and Peter share the blame here for Harry's psyche cracking. As in loving both of them and then discovering their true identities, it created great conflict in him, causing him to turn on Spider-Man and later also to resent his father and his role as Green Goblin. And kind of his legacy, really, because he also, kind of gets that crazy from his dad, just saying. Number 5, tried to make Spider-Man his heir. If you can't beat him, make them join you. Mwahaha! That was Norman's thinking in the Revenge of the Green Goblin story anyways. Here, Norman attempts to brainwash Peter Parker into giving in to his dark side and joining the Green Goblin legacy. I guess I should say his green side. Of course, Norman didn't succeed in the end, but for a moment there, it almost seemed like he might. He also put Peter through hell during this whole endeavor, so regardless of whether or not his plan was successful, it was still pretty awful for Peter the whole time. Number 4, killed JJ. That's right, while in main continuity, JJ would end up being blackmailed by Norman Osborn, in the Ultimate Universe, he would end up being murdered by him. I know, so crazy, especially considering that Jameson thought he had actually shot Norman dead and was in the middle of panicking over the fact. Norman, however, surprised him by getting up and transforming into his goblin self, revealing that in this universe, he was Immortal Green Goblin. Yep, before we had the Immortal Hulk series, we had this. Number 3, director of Hammer. During Dark Reign, we see Norman Osborn basically become the head of what ends up being the S.H.I.E.L.D. replacement. Due to the fact that he eliminated the Skrull Queen, he gets to take over and creates his own agency called Hammer, an acronym that doesn't initially stand for, well, anything actually. It was just picked because Osborn thought it was cool. As the director of Hammer, Osborn also took it upon himself to put together his own Avenger team, with him as the leader, Iron Patriot. Being a villain himself, you can guess what kind of people he called on to assemble his Avengers team. More villains, and some really confused and tormented heroes like Sentry. This was a really dark time in Marvel's history as Norman Osborn used all this power to do all sorts of awful stuff, all under the guise or in the often false name of heroic reasoning. Number 2, killed Gwen Stacy. We all know this one to be one of the worst things that Norman as the Green Goblin has done, so I don't think it's a surprise that this one is high up on our list. One of the worst, not just from Peter's perspective, by the way, but also from fans' perspectives. Many still believe that Gwen was actually the one destined to be with Peter, and in fact, that she would be a better match for him than Mary Jane herself. I personally love MJ and Peter together, and I like to think of Gwen's death as a what if that can only really ever theoretically be answered if she lived. Still, even just from Spider-Man's perspective, this has to be one of the most dastardly deeds his foe has ever committed, as Peter Parker for years has also still blamed himself for Gwen's demise, making this wound just that much more tender and that much more deep. As Green Goblin did it, but then Peter still blamed himself. Rough. Number 1, had children with Gwen Stacy. It was really hard for me to try and reason which of these last few points was really the worst, because they're all really bad, especially these last two. Killing Gwen or having children with her. Which one is worse? In the end, however, considering that he later kills her, I figured this one took the cake. Yep, as if Norman Osborn wasn't diabolical and creepy enough in the comics, we had to retcon in something even more nauseating for him. Enter Sin's past. Here it's retconned in that Norman and Gwen slept together, and as if that wasn't bad enough, he got her pregnant. She gave birth to twins in secrecy in Europe who would be raised by Norman to think that Spider-Man was their father, and that it was he who had killed their mother. I'm not sure if it gets any worse than that, but if it does, I don't think I want to find out how it gets worse. What do you think are some of the worst acts that Norman Osborn has ever committed? Which version of Norman Osborn do you think is the most horrific? Red Goblin, anyone? Which version of Green Goblin do you think is the most dastardly? Let us know in the comments below. And speaking of comments, it's time to turn to some comments from one of our latest videos, Top 10 Worst Things That Happened to Scarlet Witch. Oh, what? And she's on my shirt. What? Amari Aaron comments, retcons are the worst things that have happened to Scarlet Witch. I agree with you. Yes. You, yes. Aurelian's soul warns WandaVision started with laughter. It will end in tears. It probably will end in lots of tears. I feel like it's already made me cry, actually. When Wanda was giving birth, I actually like cried, and I don't know what that's about. I don't know if that's like just a like mother instinct or what that was, but I felt that. I don't have kids, but I was like, whoo, you're making me feel this like moment. Yeah, I think if Elizabeth Olsen has anything to say about it, we're definitely gonna be crying. There won't be a dry eye in the house. Betito Garcia shares, for me, Scarlet Witch will always be a hero, even though she's been manipulated into committing evil acts sometimes. And yes, more videos of Scarlet Witch. She's one of my favorite characters. Well, I completely agree with you on that, and I would love to do more videos on Scarlet Witch, so let's do it. I'm into it. I love Scarlet Witch. She's such a misunderstood character. And that's all the time we have for comments today. Be sure to comment below for a chance to have your thoughts and feels shouted out in a future list. This has been Top 10 Nerd, and I'm your host, Amanda McKnight. Till next time, you stay nerdy, YouTube.